Idriss Deby has died just a day after he won elections, securing him a sixth term in office. Troops have been deployed to the streets of the capital, N'Djamena. Air and land borders are closed until further notice, and a curfew is in place. Deby was reportedly killed as he led his troops in a frontline battle against rebels in the north of the country. Deby's son has been named as interim head of state, but the rebels have rejected that transition and are vowing to march on the capital.
Residents of Chad reacted with disbelief to the televised announcement of President Idriss Deby's death.
Marshal of Chad, Idriss Deby Itno, as he did every time when the Republic's institutions were seriously threatened, took the heroic lead in a combat operation against terrorists who had come from Libya. He was injured in the engagement and died after being brought back to N'Djamena.
Chad's army says that the country's president, Idriss Deby, has died just a day after he won elections, securing him a sixth term in office. Troops have been deployed to the streets of the capital, N'Djamena. Air and land borders are closed until further notice, and a curfew is in place. Deby was reportedly killed as he led his troops in a frontline battle against rebels in the north of the country. Deby's son has been named as interim head of state, but the rebels have rejected that transition and are vowing to march on the capital.
Residents of Chad reacted with disbelief to the televised announcement of President Idriss Deby's death.
Marshal of Chad, Idriss Deby Itno, as he did every time when the Republic's institutions were seriously threatened, took the heroic lead in a combat operation against terrorists who had come from Libya. He was injured in the engagement and died after being brought back to N'Djamena.
Et a rendu l'âme une fois rapatrié à N'Djamena.
The news came just hours after he was declared the winner of the country's presidential election on April 11th. It would have been the long-term leader's sixth term in office. It's sad news. The presidential election took place calmly. And just a day after they announced his win, they announced his death. This news is very surprising. On a human level, it is touching. But there are rumors that the information disseminated by the Transition Council is false. It is not known why Deby would have visited the front line or participated in the clashes. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, and some observers question the military's narrative. Following the announcement, a military council deployed the army around the capital and imposed a curfew. It also dissolved the country's government and parliament and named Deby's 38-year-old son as transitional leader. He heads the elite presidential guard that oversaw his father's security. Deby was among the world's longest-serving leaders. The herder's son took the classic path to power through the army. In 1990, his rebel forces overthrew the then-president in a coup. During his 30-year rule, he became a key ally of the West and supplied weaponry and soldiers to the anti-jihadist campaign in the Sahel region. His unexpected death could spell the beginning of a new period of uncertainty in a deeply troubled region.
Let's bring in Reid Brody here. He's counsel and spokesperson for Human Rights Watch and joins us from Barcelona. Thanks for being with us, Mr. Brody. First of all, Idriss Deby ruled Chad for more than 3 decades. How would you describe his legacy?
Well, I would say charitably, it's a mixed legacy. Of course, Idriss Deby came to power by defeating his predecessor, Hissène Habré, who was certainly the most brutal of Chad's leaders, who committed crimes against humanity and who was recently convicted, actually, by a court in Senegal for massive crimes, including sexual slavery, murder, torture. And Idriss Deby came in promising Chadians liberty. And he established a truth commission, one of the first in Africa, to look at the crimes of his predecessor. But it soon became very clear that he was going to use the same tactics. And he brought back many of Habre's people, and he became more and more autocratic. I mean, he never reached that level of brutality, and he always maintained a semblance of constitutional rule. There were elections. There were opposition parties, there was opposition press, but these elections more and more became mere formalities, and there was human rights abuses, arbitrary detention, and probably most of all corruption. During Idriss Deby's time in power, oil was discovered in the south of Chad and began to flow through Cameroon, but that oil money was used to support the elite of his country.
Okay, what do you expect to happen in Chad now with the death of its leader? He'd been in place for 3 decades, as we mentioned. What are the prospects for achieving stability in Chad at this point?
Well, of course, that's the thing that Chad offered, was stability. I mean, this is a very volatile region. You've got Libya falling apart above Chad. You've got Sudan, which broke in half. You've got a war in Central African Republic. You've got Boko Haram in Nigeria. So what Idriss Deby offered was stability. And that's why for 3 decades, the West supported Idriss Deby, just as they had supported Hissan Habre before him. I think now we don't know. I mean, I'm very worried today for the situation in Chad itself. I mean, on the one hand, the rebels, I don't think that will happen, but the rebels could win, and they could be worse than Deby. Many of them are tied to Hissan Habre. They come from his small ethnic group, and they could start taking revenge on Idriss Deby's ethnic group, the Sahrawi. And also, the other possibility is that the government will take advantage of this chaos, as they did in 2008 when rebels marched into Jamena and were turned back, take advantage of this situation to attack and disappear political opponents. So it's a very scary period right now inside of Chad.
Mr. Brody, thank you very much for your insights. That was Reed Brody, counsel and spokesperson for Human Rights Watch.
You're welcome.
It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Istanbul, Borzo Dargahi, international correspondent for The Independent. How are you?
Good. Great.
You had to think about it. Joining us as well, Leila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com. How are things?
Good. I don't have to think about it.
You don't have to
think
think
Friday.
About it. It's Friday. Jeremy Stubbs, deputy editor of the French news magazine Causeur, with us as well. How are things?
Not looking good. I'll be using that expression later on.
Not looking good. Uh-oh. Let's see if that's contagious. France 24 Washington correspondent. We love visitors. France 24 Washington correspondent Kedivon Gorjestani. Thanks for coming to the mothership and gracing us with your presence.
Thank you for having me back.
All right. The World This Week, which you can always catch on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. It's a tragedy that we also announced he was off to fight a war. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed relegating day-to-day duties to his number 2 so he could go to the front and join the effort to stop Tigrayan-led rebels who say they're intent on marching on the capital, some of the fighting less than 200 kilometers now from Addis Ababa. On Friday, these images of Abiy in fatigues appearing on his official Twitter account.
What you see behind me is a mountain area that was a stronghold for the enemy until yesterday. Now we've managed to clear the area fully. The morale of the defense force is really great. The war is being undertaken with great effort. Now we have taken Kasagita.
Now, this is, again, from the official Twitter account of Abiy Ahmed, so there's no way to verify. Your reaction, though, when you see those pictures, for 2 days we were wondering if he'd really had gone to the front.
Well, when he made that announcement, I was at once reminded of Chadian President Idriss Deby, who was killed on the front line. And when that news broke, a lot of people...
Both military men.
Exactly. But I remember a lot of people who were not familiar with West Africa went like, what is a president doing on the front line? And now we have, another great leader on the front line. Took a while for these images to come out. But Abiy right now is controlling the narrative more than ever. Just today he had, there was even more censorship, which would even cover journalists, trying to figure out where are the rebels and what's the position. If you report anything that is not passed by the Ethiopian authorities, you are guilty of supporting the terrorists. This is also the classic moves of leaders who do not want to engage in any sort of dialogue. So to have a Nobel Peace Prize winner now on the front line, using a rhetoric where I cannot even see how the two parties will come to the table for some sort of a dialogue and discussion. So Abiy has just decided that this is a zero-sum game. It's incredible.
He's not the only one, and yes, the war effort does include celebrity endorsements. We've seen this week Ethiopia and perhaps Africa's greatest ever long-distance runner, Haile Gebrselassie, who announcing that at age 48 he too is ready to take up arms. Kedevan Gorgestani, you heard Leela talk about, for the government side, it being a zero-sum game. The same is perhaps true for the rebels, and the fog of war has drifted as far as Washington, D.C., where there's a big Ethiopian diaspora.
Yes, and over the past few weeks in Washington, every time I went to the White House, especially on the weekends, there were these big protests. I mean, you always see protests in front of the White House, but this latest one on Sunday, where I was there were probably maybe a few thousand people in front of the White House, mainly pro-government Ethiopians who had signs saying the U.S. stop supporting the terrorists of TPLF, stop sanctioning the government of Ethiopia, stop sanctioning the government of Eritrea, stop basically taking the side of the TPLF. And there was a press conference from the U.S. envoy to the Horn of Africa just on Tuesday. He came back. He was during the weekend in Ethiopia speaking to the two sides. He came back and he was asked about the situation, and he was trying to, he repeated over and over again during that briefing that the U.S. was not taking sides. He said that this information out there, these accusations that the U.S. is trying to favor the TPLF over the government, is totally false narrative. And what they're trying to do is get the two sides together. He did say that there was very little progress in the fact that both sides were actually talking to the Americans, but he also said, I don't want to sound overly optimistic because the situation on the ground is extremely concerning to the Americans. And you've seen the messages from the U.S. Embassy to U.S. nationals in Ethiopia saying, you need to get out now. We will not be able to get you out later. Yeah,
that's part of the resentment against Western chancelleries, Borzo Daragahi, is these travel advisories to citizens to leave Ethiopia. And again, it's the optics don't look great. You heard Kedevan there talk about the U.S. envoy Jeffrey Feltman, and it made it sound like neither side, again, wants to sit down.
I mean, this is such a horrible tragedy. The entire Horn of Africa, not just Ethiopia or Eritrea, Sudan, even Somalia is sinking again back into despair and war and so on. And this was a region that just a few years ago was not only like a little bit of a success story, but becoming a magnet for some emerging market or frontier market investing. So what's happened is really awful and really tragic. But I think that if you talk to some people, and I'm not an expert on the Horn of Africa, but some very smart people that I have spoken to about it, say that one of the reasons for what's happening in that whole region is the U.S. disengagement, Western disengagement and apathy during the Trump years. And we're basically reaping the harvest of not having any attention on this very fragile area, not having any robust diplomatic engagement with these governments, with these countries. If we recall, the invasion started in that the war started in Ethiopia during that dangerous interregnum during right after Trump was defeated in the elections.
Yeah, the day after.
It was focused on what was happening in the U.S. And so, this just sort of shows what the famous adage that, nature abhors a vacuum.
Yeah, it's that age-old question, isn't it, Jeremy Stubbs, which is the West gets accused of getting too involved, and then in this case accused of doing nothing, or by doing nothing, the accusation's been leveled that it gave a free pass to both sides to ratchet it up.
Well, that's it. Damned if you do and damned if you don't, as it were. But of course, when Mr. Abiy came to power, there was a great wave of hope. I mean, he got the Nobel Peace Prize. Everybody thought this is the man who's going to change everything. And of course, the fact is, though, that it was these internal tensions, these ethnic tensions, and the Tigrayans having a greater share of power than was proportional to their population was, I mean, not necessarily their fault, as it were, but that's the start of it all. I think that, that there are more internal tensions here than foreign delinquency at work. But the trouble now is that how do you come in, how do you intervene when really you can't see one side as being the good side and the other as being the bad? You can't pick sides, so what do you do?
I agree. I mean, there are very few good guys in this. The TPLF.
But you have to do something, because otherwise if you have a Balkanization of Ethiopia with the spillover effect on neighboring Sudan, which has issues of its own these days, what do you do?
Well, I mean, Ethiopia is, prides itself on the only African country that was not colonized. But, it was not colonized, but it's always been a very difficult mix of, they call them nationalities, of different ethnic groups. And there has never, it's always been a case of one ethnic group being on the ascendance. When the TPLF was in power, they had an extremely shoddy human rights track record. What amazes me is that that Abiy did not, as a statesman, see the TPLF's military power. The TPLF is an enormous fighting force. When you're talking about the Horn of Africa, it is the Tigrayan fighters that have been in peacekeeping missions in Somalia, and they are always considered among the most reliable battalions. When the TPLF left the Ethiopian military after this crisis happened, you saw the Ethiopian military just collapse, and now we have Abiy on the front lines. But in terms of even the military power, he just decided that the National Army had the might to take on the TPLF, which is just a miscalculation on his part.
All right, we're going to continue, of course, to follow this story. Before we go, he's been a thorn in the side of Turkey's